Well, hello and welcome to the first event of this day of the Platypus International Convention 2023. It is our 15th international convention, hosted by the Platypus Affiliated Society. So the Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old left, it's 1920s to 30s, the new left, so the 1960s and 70s, and the post-political left, 1980s and 90s, for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. You can learn more about our activities or find a chapter local to you by visiting our website, that is platypus1917.org, or by emailing platypusvirtual@gmail.com. I will now read the panel description or the description of this event, and then I will shortly introduce the speakers and just give a little introduction on how this is gonna work now. Okay, so the description. Socialisterna Välfärdspartiet, that is Swedish and translation, and in English it means Socialists, the Welfare Party, is a socialist party that was established in Sweden in 2003. One of its founding members, Johannes Regell, who is sitting here, will be giving now a presentation on how Socialisterna envisions reform and revolution. Yes, so that will be the content of the talk or of the presentation. Johannes is going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then his presentation will be followed by a Q&A session. If you have questions, you can line up here. Please use the microphone so we have your questions on the recording and on the live stream. And it would be great if there wouldn't be like a line, maybe just 2 or 3 people at the same time in front of the microphone, so that we don't have a line going out of the door. All right, to the introduction. Johannes Regell was, like I mentioned already, a founding member of what today is called, I'm going to say it in English now, the Socialists, the Welfare Party. This is in Västervik, Sweden, back in 2003. He has been elected to Västervik City Council 4 times since then. Today he lives in Visby on the island Gotland in the Baltic Sea. Johannes has also been a union activist since 2007 in 2 different industries. First in wood manufacturing as a normal factory worker, and later in construction among electricians. He's a shop steward in the electricians union at his workplace, and he's in the national leadership of the Welfare Party and responsible for the newly restarted work on workplaces. So, my name is Andreas, and let's give, please, a warm round of applause for Johannes. All right.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Andreas. And thanks for letting me speak here today and you coming to listen. I also want to start right away by expressing my thanks to the Platypus Affiliated Society for all the good work you have done over the years. There are very few things that I have found as inspiring and thought-provoking in a long time. So enough of saying thanks now. I will try not to do too much chronology stuff. I will go through some essential things though, so those of you who haven't read my article in the PR can at least have a clue what I'm speaking about. I will, for the sake of clarity, just refer to the organization that I represent as the Socialists. That was what we were being called since the start, so we adopted the name later. But there have been other names as well. So to avoid unnecessary confusion, I will go with the Socialists. I would like to begin with giving a short introduction to what sort of town is Västervik, where I'm from and where we started. Västervik is located on the southeast coast of Sweden. The municipality, or commune as we call it in Swedish, includes both the town of Västervik and the rural area around it, and has some 36,000 plus inhabitants, of which 21,500 lives in Västervik town. So it's a small town. The size of the area of the municipality is somewhere in between the state Rhode Island and the state Delaware, to give you some context. Historically, Västervik has been an industrial town with lots of manufacturing. On the countryside, there has also been many industries with small communities built up around them. Today, most industries in Västervik have shut down. Those are still around, while highly productive, employing a much smaller workers' numeral today. So, we began as a movement among students of the Västervik Gymnasium. The gymnasium is year 10 to 12 in the Swedish school system. So we were all between the age of 17 and 19 when we started, indeed quite young. The same year we joined a socialist party, the SP. The SP was then the Swedish section of the Fourth International. We ran local election first time in 2006 and got voted in. And then we continued on that path in 2010 and 14 and 18 and 22. So first time we were elected to city council, we got 2.8% of the votes. And our highest achieved number was 5.05 in 2018. In the 2022 election, we backed a little bit. During these years that have passed, we have made 2 attempts of going national, none of them very successful. In 2008, we broke with the SP, but I will return more on that later. Besides anti-austerity politics, which has been our foremost focus, we have also been involved in street anti-fascism, shop floor organizing, study groups, and tenements organizing. So with that said, let's move on to the not so small question of reform or revolution. We never presented ourselves as revolutionary socialists. The reason for this was not that we rejected the necessity for fundamental social change. On the contrary, we rarely missed a good occasion to point that necessity out. We identified the contradiction within the labor movement to be around the question of class collaboration or class struggle, not reform or revolution. We meant that clinging to the contradiction between revolutionary and reformist socialism was more a hindrance than a help to any possible march forward. This was not because we felt unease talking about revolution. We meant, though, it would only be pretty much just that, talk, that is, about revolution. We did not see the contradiction between reform or revolution to in any real way define the moment in history in which we found ourselves in. The foremost reason for this was that we meant that there was no longer any reformist socialist labor movement to speak about. This connects to our problems with the 70s left. For us, it did not really matter so much what those seeking political home among us thought about the period of class collaboration. They could either love it or hate it. Important was only that they now understood that it was over and most likely never to return. We saw it as a historical parenthesis and rather an exception in capitalist reality than the norm. According to us, the fateful error of our contemporary revolutionaries, no matter on which side of Lenin's inheritance dispute they were to be found, was that they were all stuck in fantasy and wishful thinking about themselves and our present moment. The way we saw it, they fooled themselves into believing that they were actual revolutionaries, just like Lenin, who fought with deceitful reformists over power within an actual existing socialist labor movement. In our mind, these revolutionaries could not even measure against yesterday's reformists. This level of delusion made them so irrelevant that there was no point for us to even bother, we thought. We understood the historical defeat of the labor movement against fascism in the 30s as a consequence of Stalin's ultra-leftist third period a la 1928. We did not free social democracy from guilt, but we did put higher demand and responsibility on those who had broken with social democracy. It was their task to be better. Why else break away? We saw the effects of Stalin's third period as helping the social democratic right to strengthen its grip over the working class rather than challenging it, which also happened in Sweden. In Sweden, this led to a split within the communist movement, with two parties existing next to each other, both under the same name of Communist Party of Sweden, SKP. The minority was loyal to the Comintern, and they expelled the party majority. Among the Muscovite loyalist minority, the majority of the members were unemployed. Among those kicked out were most of the communist trade union cadres. They understood the disastrous consequences of fighting their fellow social democratic workmates as social fascists. Why this detour over the interwar period, you may ask? Well, you see, we saw those parties on the fringe left existing beside us who had all came out of the 70s left as being guilty, perhaps to a different degree, of bringing back the same detrimental shit legacy of the 1930s and running that another round in the 70s. Only with a difference, as you so well put it, of now being farcical rather than tragical. By committing this grave error yet again, in their own generation, they made life easy for the social democratic right, and hence paved the way for the sad situation we found ourselves in. They themselves never draw this conclusion, but were all, in our time, rather nostalgic over their youthful days of radicalism. And we ruled them all out for that. We were firmly determined to get beyond them. In some ways, I think we did, but that did not save us from fooling ourselves in our own way. Instead of seeking our way in going back to Bolshevism before Stalinism, we sought our inspiration in the social democratic left before 1914. Yes, indeed, I know that Bolshevism was a part of the same social democratic left. But we meant that there was not so much for us to get from the Russians, much because of Russia's economic backwardness. We understood it as the Bolsheviks had to be the Bolsheviks because of the Russian conditions, and things went as they did because of the defeat of world revolution. End of story. But for us, who saw our task as one of starting over again from square one. Bebel, Luxemburg, and young Pannekoek seemed much more relevant than Lenin and Trotsky. Of course, we also sought inspiration from our own pioneer heroes in the Swedish social democracy of the late 19th century. We also looked more closely at the later reformist left of the social democracy under the start and height of the class collaborationist era. By this I mean those who never rejected socialism as the aim of their strivings. We sort of forgave them, we can say, in the light of Stalinism, and could not see ourselves as being anything other than left social democrats if we would have lived in that time. Our own strain, let's call it Västervik socialism, surely started already in the SP, but it got more cultivated after we broke with them. We broke without any internal fighting. We did not fight over party line or weekly paper. We just wanted a way and out. In our mind, they had since long abdicated from the struggle for freedom in our own country and put all their hopes to struggles abroad. We said that they had turned Trotsky's maxim that socialism can't be built in one country into their own, that socialism apparently has to be built in some other country. Our thought road to mass influence. We could say things like, the working class did not get socialist because workers sat home and read Das Kapital. The working class got socialist because the social democrats were the only ones who did not shy away when things got hot. The movement of the working class in Sweden did not start with social democracy or socialism. The legendary tailor-master, agitator and organizer August Palm gave the first social democratic speech in Sweden as late as 1881. Before then, worker-friendly liberals and free churches, I don't know if you call them free churches here in America, but I do know that you got plenty of them. They had both been organizing workers for decades. The difference between them and the new social democracy was in their view upon the said question of class collaboration and class struggle. The workers' friends told the workers to plead kindly to the capitalists and their authorities within the state, while the social democrats advocated the way of class struggle. They gained dominance by sticking to and lead on that way. This was not, in our mind, a way to say that ideas and theory was of no importance. No, only that it never was and never would be a starting point for the working class. We meant that history had now gone full circle, and we identified our task as walking the same path of struggle, but not against free churches and worker-friendly liberals, but with the old, former socialist leaderships that now had become liberals themselves. So what did this mean to the socialists from Västervik? We understood the world as split in two hostile camps, in a, to the congregation, perhaps familiar formulation, quote, in constant opposition to one another, carrying on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, end quote. We saw this fight as in our time being led by the capitalist class. The struggle therefore had to be defensive in order to win trust, build strength, and through that, political leadership. The conflict areas were to be found where the attacks of the capitalist class happened, and the task hence to defend what gains remained from the class collaborationist era. These gains were not central to our strategy because they somehow would be, small pieces of socialism. No. The point was instead that the areas where people in general and working class people in particular was being attacked would be where we could call to resistance and organize defense. We wanted to intervene where class struggle already was being waged and felt, if you will. We also meant that only socialists could take on this task consistently. We identified two areas of social conflict for this: the workplaces and the public welfare institutions. We saw the workplaces as the most important of the two, but came, without realizing it ourselves, to down-prioritize them, as the terms of involvement in small-town parliament succeeded each other. In the area of welfare politics, we identified it as a struggle over distribution of social surplus in a national scale, but enforced locally. I know that many people from other countries have, in my mind, very inaccurate image of Sweden as some form of social democratic paradise or hell, depending on who you ask. The image has never been true in any age, and if it in the past perhaps had some currency, that has since long ago been swept away. Sweden today is one of the most unequal countries within the OECD when it comes to the question of, say, wealth distribution, for example. So the price, if you will, for the social democratic success model in Sweden was, in short, the total demobilization of the working class, and hence the thorough eradication of everything relatable to class consciousness. Our political line since 2006 has been not to comply in this and to simply refuse to administer the social disarmament. Our battle cry, slogan, or whatever we want to call it, has in all its simplicity been no more cuts. So, it's high time for me now to wrap this up with addressing the elephant question in the room. How did this all go? Not as well as planned, obviously. I wouldn't be here otherwise. I really wouldn't. Our reason for entering the field of welfare politics was to give rise to a movement for social change. A movement that could gather people in big numbers and open new horizons for the future. This we did not achieve. Instead of setting people in motion, we rather gave people an excuse to stay passive. They could vote for the socialists and tell themselves that they have done something radical. Our orientation towards welfare politics and the public sector also in effect meant that we turned our backs to the core of the working class. And with that, the force for socialism, in favor of, working people in general. I have no problems with teachers, but teachers are very much not the same as factory workers, no matter how much we want to rename them into welfare workers. I still think there is some merit in our perspectives, especially when it comes to class struggle contra class collaboration. But it was clearly not enough for us to become all that much more than the fringe left we wanted to overcome. I still can't see how the road to revolution can overstep the struggle for social reforms. And I still believe that the road to socialism for the working class has to start with a struggle for something rather than the struggle for everything. But today, I no longer see the explosive potential in welfare politics, as we hoped for during the time that we tried. Even though we programmatically pointed out socialism as something fundamentally different, waiting ahead to be realized in the future. In practice, we were only ever always looking backwards towards the epoch of class collaboration that we wanted to break free from, and more specifically to the state, never the workers themselves. So, for 20 years, my comrades and I have allowed ourselves to be high enough on our own, even if ever so modest successes, that we have not seen the need for critical reflection. Today, when this is no longer possible, we are more humble before the facts. Thanks again for taking the time to listen.
Yeah, thank you, Johannes. Right, I have a few questions, but before that, I want to take questions from your audience. So please, if you have questions, you can think about them, or just come up, go to the microphone, and ask them. Okay, so really well. Oh, sorry, just another thing. Every question will be answered directly, so we do not collect questions. So.
Okay, thank you so much for coming. I thought it was a really fascinating report and reflection. So my question would be what your stance was regarding the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat or the vanguard, or these terms where you said it came out of a campus movement. Did the students view themselves as a vanguard, or who did they perceive to be the revolutionary subject in this case? Did they believe that the working class is the proletariat, or who is the proletariat, and how would you, in reflection and in hindsight, how do you see that now? And then, yeah, what your constituents were on the parliamentary side of your work. I mean, were there students voting for you mostly, or did you actually have like a large working class base? Thank you.
The wrong way? No? Okay, let's see here. There were many questions in one. If I start from the other way around. So our constituency was very much a working class constituency. And we have to understand it. Västervik is a small town. There are no university. Okay, so students means kids in age 17 to 19 in this case. So it's not like real students. They are in, okay, it's not mandatory to go in gymnasium, but it almost is. So, well, we never rejected, the idea that the working class has to take power. We never said so. But we were also not very explicit. We like to put it vaguely to make it easy for us, right? So, it's many good questions there, and I don't really know how to answer them all properly, but we saw, it's this kind of discussion, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Well, it means that the working class has to take power, but it doesn't have to be as bad as it went there, and all these things. Yeah. So, but we never sort of rejected the notion. No, we never did, and we were quite clear. This was also part of the thing. We thought sort of that the fringe left that we wanted to overcome, that we was very much a part of, still is. That they were putting too much emphasis of questions that did not really matter. So our orientation was always try to give birth to a movement for change rather than thinking, too much about how will the transitional form between capitalism and socialism really look like. We thought that's not our task to answer. So we pointed out socialism, it's abolition of wage labor, overcoming of value production, things like this. And then we pretty much left it at that. And also reason for this is that we are a very heterogeneous organization. We have people, not that we are very many of us, but we have people of different affiliations sort of in how they think of themselves as socialists. Was that any response to your question?
I really appreciate that, and I think there's a way in which also you're coming and making yourself vulnerable regarding something that I think everyone who is here has reflected a lot on and has felt very disillusioned about, and I think that means a lot to people. Yeah, so
Thank you.
I wanted to ask, do you think that the failure of your movement or like the shortcomings of your movement were due to objective conditions or like theoretical problems, such as you mentioned how teachers and factory workers or industrial workers are different, have a different relation to the means of production. If you knew what you do now, maybe having a more complex understanding of class, which does also maybe involve intermediaries. Maybe if you had some like between the capitalists and the workers, like, do you think that would have, if you could go back in time and tell your younger self what you do now, do you think that would help, or was it just not the right time and not the right place?
Good question. Well, I think it's both. When we started off, and during all this time that have passed, your notion of the death of the left, etc., was not in our thinking radius whatsoever. So that's part of the reasons why I'm here. Okay, it connects to my experiences pretty well. So that's, what did you say? Objective conditions. Yeah, we can call it that, can't we? But also, 20 years have passed, and I think we could have learned what we have learned during half that time if we would have been more humble and able to reflect. We were not really. It's simple as that. And today, the organization still exists, and we have our city council seats, etc. And we are discussing this very much, what to do in the future. And me personally, I lean very much into the idea that we should have focused more on workplace organizing. And that connects to your other question about the classes, etc. And in my mind, I'm not trying to say that only factory workers count. That's not my point, but I think that has to be the core of something. It has to expand from there. If you are to make alliances, you need to build that force first. Otherwise, you can't do that. That's how I see it today. And we sort of try to shortcut that by beginning in another end. And it had its positive sides, but I think it also, in the end, crippled our perspectives. And we got caught up in small town parliamentarism very much, I would say.
Hi, so I apologize if I kind of ramble a little bit and talk about this question. I want to pick up on something you mentioned at the very beginning of, talking about this split with the SP. And one of the things you mentioned was their focus on internationalism, right? So they would have been orientated towards a international concept of the proletariat and of a proletarian revolution. And there's this kind of turn away from that horizon in order to focus on kind of like what would a socialist party need to do to build a movement, right? So there's a kind of national focus. And then later, you mentioned that Sweden was one of the most unequal countries in the OECD, right? So the way I'm connecting this is that as I understood it, one of the reasons why Sweden is one of the most unequal countries in the OECD is due to kind of have like a high asylum and migration population which aren't able to participate or get resources from the welfare state, right? So when we talk about the, like the welfare state and the workers, it's usually like actually very, it's not even like socialism in one country, it's like socialism in one country for like people that have a passport, But this is this would have to be an issue that a Workers' Party would have to deal with, right? Is actually the concept of an international labor market and migration within countries. Now, I live in the UK, right? And in the fallout of neoliberalism, what you tend to get is kind of people that are more orientated towards the welfare state, right? So demands for like reinvestment in social like policy structure or like social welfare reforms. And the other side of it, and where you tend to get kind of like more anarchist orientations within the UK, leftist politics tend to accumulate on kind of migrant rights, asylum-seeking rights. And the UK is a really good example where you have a kind of big migration population that is like systemically like really shut out from the welfare state, and that would still have to be something that the left, and at least in the UK, it's very rare that you get the left able to like bridge these two questions of like the welfare state and then like the non-national working class, right? Where you do get it is actually exactly within those sectarian, like ostensible Marxist leftist groups, at least like the Trotskyists, right? So that's kind of the question I wanted to pose to you is actually when did the, because a lot of leftist politics around the world do center around migration, like migration rights and justice for kind of asylum seekers or people that are systemically excluded from the welfare state. I wanted to just check in with how you might have approached that problem, or whether it was something taboo, kind of within the party.
Many good questions there as well. I'll try to answer them in the right order this time. So firstly, when we rejected the Trotskyists and their internationalism, it wasn't really that we said internationalism isn't important in any way. We have said, to make an anecdote, when the war in Libya started, I think the SP, we had already broken since long with them, they had an extra congress on how to see the conflict, and we were making jokes about them and saying like, I don't think anyone in Benghazi is waiting to hear what SP in Sweden have to say. And that was sort of how we thought about it, that we wanted to really make difference, that's the thing. So we said, okay, we can't affect these things in any way, so fuck it. Let's do something that we might have impact in. That was how we thought. And this connects also to the other question you're raising here, that the orientation towards welfare politics, and this is what I would say is in a theoretical level, the biggest problem. It made us very much oriented towards the state. And we were consequent on that line, which meant that we said no to labor import, and we said we should have much less immigration, and all these things. So it followed a certain logic. And we were, of course, racists for that as well. But we were racists already before that, because we also said no to honorary killings and no to political Islam, etc., etc. So we were racist a good time before that. I'm making a joke here, I hope you understand. Was it any response to your question?
No, yeah, it was yeah. Well, maybe specifically also this idea of like a taboo. So was there, within the party, was there kind of, was it difficult to talk about things like migration?
No, not for us. We were sort of the anti-PC left before that came about in Sweden.
Yeah. Okay.
So that was never any problem for us. There are many funny anecdotes I could tell about it, but that would steal your time for questions, so thank you.
Yeah, like the others have said, thanks very much for coming and talking to us, it's much appreciated. I'm interested in your recognition early on of the new left generation, what you describe as the 70s groups, repeating the 30s. That's actually a very deep insight that was very important to the founding of Platypus in 2006 was specifically looking at this way in which the kind of young or early millennial left really confronted something about what was the new left, how did it wrestle and fail to deal with the legacy of the 30s, both in trying to break from it completely and thereby paradoxically repeating it. So I'm very interested that you kind of had this same insight and you presented it almost as a kind of spontaneous insight mixed with some kind of repulsion. And so I'm wondering, did you, one of the things we're interested in Platypus is this kind of tension within the New Left, especially early on, where it's not exactly clear whether they're going to fail in that task of reproducing the 30s, or like that they will fall into that trap of reproducing the 30s. And did you kind of, in your group or personally, conduct any kind of investigation into that, or how did that insight occur to you? What was the kind of basis for it? And yeah, thanks again.
So the question that I can answer quite quick, and we had intergenerational mentorship. So we had new leftists that had failed and learned something that helped us, sort of not walking in the same tracks as they did. But that also is what led us to become sort of left social democrats. So.
Thank you for your presentation, and I have about 2 questions. And the first is, though you want to go back to the politics without the inheritance of those revolutionaries, but you would notice that the situation is different from the things before, and so people are rather more flattened than century ago. And so how would you recruit people to your left movement? And this is my first question. And the second question is, how would you use your parliamentary participation, which is, like you mentioned, your seats in the city council, to raise the people's awareness to your movement? And this is my second question.
Thank you. So we were never recruiting we should be like the first social democrats. That wasn't what we were saying, of course, but that was how we was thinking about our task rather. So we tried to recruit around the concrete questions. And this is the funny thing in that sense, because Västervik is a small town and we were sort of the only radical left organization existing. Most of our members had no previous background in any sense. That's why I called it our own strain of Västervik socialism, so to speak, because they were pretty much steeped in what we were doing and thinking about ourselves and the world. And the idea with small town parliamentarism was that was to use it as a platform to bring out our ideas. Which you could say we did kind of successfully, but it didn't lead to what we were hoping for. So, I mean, we were always fighting in parliament, of course, and newspapers were writing, and we were making YouTube videos, and we were... So it gave us access. We could call the local newspapers, and they have rarely anything to write, so if we want to look grim on a picture and say this is horrible, and then they will write that. So we were doing that all the time. So, and we was kind of good at it, I would say, but it didn't translate into what we hoped for. But so we used Parliament as a platform to bring out our ideas by fighting with the opponents. And that was directly inspired by a pamphlet written by the young Anton Pannekock that you can't find in English, unfortunately. It's called The Different Tactical Differences Within the Labour Movement. And he's writing about this very strategy, how you should use Parliament, etc. And we read that and we said, this is good.
Thank you.
Hi. I have a question which is a bit similar to Ephraim's question, gentleman over there. You mentioned the third period Stalinism, and it's kind of, you painted a very clear picture of the self-destructive course of the Comintern. And consequences for the whole communist world. But I think it's important to remember that, of course, third period Stalinism, the social fascism thesis, was followed by popular frontism, which was institutionalized until, well, in a way it still is. You know, when the communist partisans, the anti-fascist fighters, disarmed and formed coalition governments with bourgeois parties in France and in Italy, for example. And it seems that this is almost like a cycle, because third period Stalinism, in a way, reasserted itself during the 60s and 70s with kind of the heroic phase of Maoism, if that's an expression that makes sense. So it seems that this idea has a continued power, ideological power, of, you know, this kind of left Stalinism, if you will. And of course, in a way, the other turn, you know, the zig to the zag, to use Trotsky's expression, also continues with, you know, with Khrushchevism or with popular frontism or with Deng Xiaoping or with or with the left today, with the turn towards Bernie Sanders or the getting serious. The getting serious movement, in a way, happens also in a cycle. So how would you deal with this continued kind of dynamic? First of all, do you think this is still true in the left today? And then how would you deal with this continued cycle and the ideological power of both getting serious and, let's call it, radicalism?
Good question. Well, we can't translate these things into today to begin with. There are problems with that, which we didn't understand when we were coming to realize that, sort of. For us, how we never saw ourselves as, you know, popular frontists or anything like that. We were quite clear that was another bad turn, so to speak, and like you said, France, etc. But we were not thinking very much about it either. We were pretty much, you know, we need to get back to doing these things. And it's like I said, the reason being for us entering into welfare politics wasn't that it was small pieces of socialism in our mind, but we saw that it's like we didn't have to invent people's demands, because they were already raised, but no one was on the same side as those being pissed off at cuts in schools or elder care hospitals, whatever. So we said, well, let's be on that side, because we saw that as connecting to our perspectives. We saw it as an expression of class struggle in society. It's not a very good answer to your question at all, but I don't think I can answer it much better than, so I hope you can be happy with that.
Can I ask a quick follow-up?
You're welcome.
Okay. You didn't see yourself kind of as part of this, you could call it historical dynamic if it exists. Would you today kind of describe your earlier selves within such terms? Or
No.
No. Okay. Thank you.
No, I would not, because, like I said, in our self-understanding, what we were doing was starting over from before all these tragedies occurring, so to speak. So that was how we saw what we were about to do. So we go back to the beginning, so to speak, when it was, and this was also like an ideal for us, how we thought about our organization with our heterogeneity. Do you say that in English? Yeah? Thank you. That we never tried to say, okay, so you're a reformist, you're not welcome. We didn't think like that. We said, okay, you understand that we have to fight in order to get anywhere. Okay, welcome. That was it. And rest would sort of be a question for debate that we knew we couldn't really answer until we had gotten anywhere practically forward. So we said, like, all these ideas, how would socialism be like and what's the next step? We said, well, we can discuss that as much as we want, but we will not have that as, you know, any dividing lines between who is a friend and who's a foe, so to speak. So if you understand that we need to fight, if we working people have to fight to get anywhere, then you're welcome. That was how we saw it, very simplistically.
Yeah, I'm very sorry. I'm just gonna use my power as a moderator here to squeeze in my question. I hope that's all right. We still have, like 45 minutes, so I'm sure you guys are gonna get a chance to ask your question. And what I want to do is I want to read a very short paragraph from the article you have written and published in the PR, which I again can recommend strongly for everyone to read. It's a great piece, a very timely piece of reflection. And there you write, implicit in how we have written our programs and found inspiration amongst the Second International radicals is that there is a left that exists. That it is somehow the same thing now as then, and that it is just not good enough. We saw that the left had been Stalinist, social democratic, middle class dominated from 1968 onwards, and totally degenerated with postmodernism in our days. Besides that, we thought we only had to not be bad like all the others, and things would be great. We never posed a question like this, but today it looks like we thought that overcoming a 100-year-long process of the eradication of class consciousness was to be somehow circumvented only if we were active enough. We thought that distancing ourselves from the stinking corpse of the left would overcome the death of the left. End of quote. And I kind of want to open up the discussion a bit and point to the events which we will host in the coming days, because the inspiration by Second International radicals is something that, of course, not only happened in Sweden. We will have the CPGB's Mike McNair on a panel. We will have the Marxist Unity Group on a panel, on several panels actually, and we will pose this question again of the inspiration of Second International radicalism, of also neo-Kautskianism, in a transatlantic context, to put it like that. So this is the one thing I want to raise, to keep that question in mind, and I hope you can also contribute to these discussions from your experience. And the second point or question I want to make is, just for clarification, you also mentioned in your article that the strategy you sort of derived from Pannekoek's text towards winning seats in small council parliaments, that you were quite self-aware that this is just a means, not an end in itself, and that the actual aim of your party, of your organization, is to do civil social organizing within the working class. So I kind of want you to clarify, like, where was do you think like you ended up where you end up because these like relationships of this relationship between means and ends turned itself upside down, or that somehow getting elected to small local parliaments got you the feeling that you actually achieved something, but in the end you didn't? Or where did you see the actual obstacle for your organization within the last 10 to 15 years when it comes down to civil social organizing the working class?
So, to begin with, we said explicitly in every election that we have been running that voting for us won't change fuck all, really. We only do this to build a movement. So we said that explicitly. And if you want to help out with that, if you share our perspectives, you're welcome to support us. So that was how we said it. And the sad answer to your question is that we didn't realize it until we were totally exhausted in energy. We really had to hit the wall before we started thinking about that, I would say. And I'm speaking very much about myself as well, since I've been a driving member in the whole period that has passed. Was that an answer, really?
Well, so your point is that it was too much to do. Like, after you got seats in parliament, you were actually like already overworked structurally within the organization and realized that there is no time or energy to do the other stuff?
We sort of, without realizing it ourselves, got more into this. That we really need to make something of this. People are voting for us, and they expect some things, and we started to put more and more energy into making something of that. But we could have done that as well, perhaps. But it's not that we did that. That's the problem. Is what we stopped doing, really. Because if we look at it through the whole time that has passed, we were much more focused, and I return to this all the time, into the workplace activities, which we never really did consistently after, I don't know, 2011 perhaps. So the first part of our organization was perhaps the best time. And it was sort of when we started to realize we can't go on, because we've spent 20 years now. If we're gonna do this for 20 more years, that would be really fucking pathetic in the end, because this one, we will be exactly like those we wanted to not be like. Sounds like a parent relationship here, but
Thanks.
So you brought up the importance of workplace organizing and how your prior strategy was about like defending certain public institutions from austerity, and so you had like your understanding of like political demands was this kind of defensive, like we need to defend these institutions. So my question is, moving forward, how do you think the alternative should be in what you would perceive in organizing workplaces, the political demands, right? So what kind of political demands going forward should be done, and in retrospect, what kind of political demands should have been done? Yeah, that's my question.
So first, to be clear, I'm really answering this question. I'm much more speaking from my own head than representing the organizational view, so I want to be clear about that. If someone back home sees this and becomes pissed off, it's said at least, okay? Well, what I think about workplace organizing is that it's not a political demands at all. Those should be consciously avoided. I think that's an obstacle. And it's a typical sort of radical left error. Oh yeah, so I got to work in a factory now, we're gonna push the party newspaper. That's stupid shit that we need to get rid of. What it's about, in my understanding, is that, we need to understand Sweden is a bit special here, because if we look at Europe now, you got strike waves in many countries. What do you have in Sweden? Nothing. The Swedish union movement can't even give demands for compensation for inflation. Not even that. So they're responsible even before entering. And it's like inflation 10%, wage demands 4%. But we won't get that anyway. So the way I think about this is that what the task really has to be is to develop skills for working class leaders on the workplaces. How can you get workers to fight for their interests? Even if the smallest scale, really. How can you get people active? Because this is what we lost, I think. Because when you do that, it is oriented towards self-activity of the working class, even if not the class as a whole, but in just a particular workplace. And I think that you can't get around that. It really has to be done. And you can't, and it doesn't connect to socialism in any way directly. But I think of it sort of, like strength training. You need to build some muscle in order to be able to do anything with a body. And that can't be overstepped, really. And I would say we either have working class militancy or socialist intelligentsia today. And that's a problem. And I will never be a proper intellectual, but I can definitely do stuff at a workplace. So I think we as an organization should rethink these questions, and because no one is doing that at the same time. No one is there. It's just totally vacated space. No one cares. And all the left groups, they're not there. No one is thinking workplace orientation. No one is. And no one is really developing ideas either. But you can't do everything at the same time, I think.
Thank you. That's it.
So first of all, thank you very much for coming all the way here to present. It's really a treat. Oh, so the gentleman over there, he's been referred to already. He actually stole my question while he was in line. So while I was in line, I had to think of another question. So maybe building off the thematics of some of these questions, the question of the new left was posed. And that's something that came to mind when you talked about intervening in welfare politics. Because when I think of welfare politics, how like activists made an intervention in the New Left era, you had people like trying to get people on welfare, cheat the system for what it's worth to point out its inadequacy, right? You would push it to its limits, and you would realize the welfare state could not live up to what it promises in terms of giving these things. It was very contradictory, and sort of therefore it points beyond itself, and then a certain organizational form, be it a mass socialist party, would be needed in order to organize these discontents. And sort of when the mass socialist party question was posed in the context of the New Left, it was maybe from like 1956 to the early 1960s, and sort of this welfare organizing question existed in a certain constellation, right? You had the Sino-Soviet split, the crisis of official communism in the East, you had the Hungarian uprising, and you also had in the United States, the crisis of the welfare state as exemplified by the civil rights movement. It was a crisis for the electoral constituency of the Democratic Party. So there was a certain constellation in which this welfare activism, trying to organize independently in society, ostensibly to point out the limitations of the welfare state, that it kind of made sense that this would point towards reconstituting a mass socialist party because there was that opportunity in that early period of the New Left. Now, you guys entered welfare organizing, and so my question to you is, what would have been the period of time in the last 2 decades of the millennial left for that opening that we saw maybe from the 1956 to the early 1960s moment of, reconstituting, say, a mass socialist politics or socialist party, so in your case, in Sweden, but, with a certain sort of backdrop that makes it amenable, where there's a crisis that produces this want. Hopefully that makes sense.
I didn't really understand your question, to be honest. Sorry.
Yeah, so welfare organizing in the context of the New Left, right? You try to get people on welfare and to point out its limitations and inadequacies and contradictions, so it would point beyond itself, right? You need an organization and not just a ragtag bunch of students in order to do this. And sort of that existed in a moment, right after the Sino-Soviet split, Hungarian uprising, and the crisis in the New Deal Democratic Party coalition, right, with the civil rights movement and Jim Crow. And sort of, I was wondering, did a similar constellation exist in Sweden for there to reconstitute a mass socialist party, and what point in period of time in the last 2 decades would you point to with, where the welfare, interventions would have been optimal or have pointed in that direction? Because we can look backwards and say, well, maybe it failed, right? But was there an optimal time, right?
Good question. Well, we never thought of it in that way at all. But the way we saw it was simply that this has been going on for a while now. And it doesn't matter whoever is in power. They do the same kind of policies in a way. They're cutting everything down. And our idea was simply to put up resistance, to get those being affected organized. And we never thought of it much more, to be honest, than, okay, this is an opportunity, no one is on their side, let's take that side, sort of. Not perhaps the answer you wanted, but best I can give.
Thanks.
So just a quick message. We have like officially 10 minutes until 11, but since we started late, we can run until maybe 10 past 11, but no longer than that because it's the first event of the day, and if we run late now, it will be horrible. But, all right, thanks.
I promise this is a short question. Thank you so much for the presentation, by the way. It was really great. But I wanted to ask, to circle back around to this idea of the industrial workers needing to be the heart of every labor movement. Do you think the same analysis of the working class from the 20th century and these 20th century thinkers and writers that you referred to in your presentation apply to increasingly deindustrialized and globalized nations where a lot of material goods flow in from outside of the country and a lot more of the jobs in the economy are tertiary sector instead of like industrial workers, as much as there might have been in the 20th century?
Short answer is yes.
So we have the long answer.
Yeah.
Okay, so I would say that there are many things you can expand on this, and if we're gonna not abdicate the international perspective, there are more factory workers today than ever has been before. Worth remembering in these discussions. And I would also argue that let's call it the core of the working class. I would argue that the striking force, the potentiality of the core of the working class has increased. Because in this economy, everything is very sensitive. And transport networks, etc., is, I mean, I would say that the potentiality in the working class has in no way decreased. I wouldn't argue that. I see that the numeral has decreased, of course, in the core capitalist countries, but that's, in my opinion, not. It brings us to an old problem. The working class has never been able to succeed alone. There's always been a need for class alliances, and I would argue that. So if I mean the whole question of how do you define classes, I don't want to get into that, but. I would argue that the difference, the distance between the core of the working class and its potential allies today are much, much, much smaller than it has ever been in history before. Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Hi. So I want to know about freedom, but I'm going to ask a specific question. I know in Sweden they have some very stringent hate speech laws. Is that correct?
Well, we have, it's called hets mot folkgrupp. It means sort of agitation towards a particular group of population.
Yes. So I understand that in 2003, I believe there was a Christian pastor who was like prosecuted for homophobia, like giving sermons that were homophobic. So he was prosecuted for that, and then in the 2015-2017 migrant crisis, there were also people who made statements online who were prosecuted for that. I want to know what your party thought about this, these hate speech prosecutions, and then I also wanted to know, also what was your party's definition of the proletariat? But I think possibly the last question sort of touched on that. Yeah.
So we don't have a particular line on the question of hate speech. We don't think it's that a big problem. We think it's sort of, if you want to tap into this whole discussion, cultural war stuff, etc., we think that's sort of the argument of those we don't like, the degenerated woke left or whatever you want to call it. But we always have had a clear stance against all type of racism, etc. I mean, we were never blurring that. Not if you ask someone else, perhaps they would claim we did, but I would say no. What we did though was to take a strong stance for free speech.
Okay, so anti-censorship?
Definitely.
Anti-censorship.
And that came about particular when it came to the question of political Islam, etc.
Ah, okay.
So there was an anecdote in city council. It was about what do you call this? The wind power things. What do you call them? Those generating electricity. Yeah. So there was, that's been a big thing in Sweden. They put them up everywhere, and people are pissed off. So there were debates about this, and then the left party was talking about some species of bird that was disturbed, I don't know the name of the bird in English, but it's the one on the famous grouse bottle, you know. Famous grouse, the whiskey. Yeah, what is it? Grouse, sorry, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. I'm not too happy with my pronunciations all the time. So it was this bird anyway, and it was. I need help with everything I'm trying to say here. What do you call the male bird then? The male bird, yeah, and it had 4 female birds, and they were all disturbed. And then the Sweden Democrats went up into parliament and said, so that's probably a very happy bird if he has 4 female birds. He must be Muslim, he said. And that was, outrageous, and everyone was declaring their distance, and, you need to apologize. And even the Sweden Democrats did that against their own speaker, and we were the only ones who said, no, you can actually make stupid jokes about religion, that's okay.
That is really interesting to me. Thank you so much. And then the proletariat part, what was the proletariat?
Yeah, to make it short, strict definition, value producers.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, first of all, I wanted to thank you for that talk. That was very honest and very great. So you titled your talk Reform or Revolution, right? And I think you described pretty clearly how that problem doesn't characterize our present situation today. And I wanted to sort of relate this to the question of the welfare state and of working class independence. Because the question Reform or Revolution was raised first within the context of the revisionist dispute in the Second International, with Bernstein and Luxemburg writing a critique of Bernstein. So it presupposed revisionism, but really more specifically what it presupposed was working class independence, namely the threat of liquidating this independence into the state. You mentioned that one of your regrets about your organizing is that it was previously, or it tended to be very state-oriented. So with that in mind, I wanted to sort of connect the problem of the inadequacy of the formulation Reform or Revolution for today to the problem of the welfare state. Maybe is it because of the lack of working class independence that we can't really pose this question? And with that in mind, I also wanted to ask, what do you think are the obstacles to like a functional working class independence today?
Well, you're hitting many sensitive spots here. Very good. Part of the problem is what you're saying about the welfare state and working class independence. But another problem, which is, for us practically became that less and less people care about it because it means less and less for people. That's also an important thing to understand. When we were starting in the early 2000s, we could say back in the 80s. Yeah, but if you say back in the 80s now, not so many people have a clue what you're talking about because it's 40 years ago now. It wasn't then, but it is now. So it's becoming ancient history. And if you want to have an orientation towards those who are the future, so to speak, it doesn't relate to them. We were good at attracting pissed off left-wing social democrats, who wanted to punish them, etc. But those are a dying breed. Not so many left of them now. And that's another problem. And to get into what's the biggest obstacle for an independent working class movement? Was that what we said? Yeah? Well, probably many things. But I might be naive here, but I think in that area things are not so grim, really. I think there is potentiality there still to be explored. Maybe ruled out but it has to be explored. And so I can't really answer that question in that sense, say this is the obstacle, because we didn't try that enough. And I'm very enthusiastic about exploring that, really. But of course, in Sweden, the obstacle is that class collaboration is so thoroughly institutionalized that you can't find people in workplaces who have ever participated in a strike. So there is really no experiences of doing things collectively. So I think that's sort of where a strategy for workplaces needs to begin. We need to teach people how to do things collectively. Teach ourselves how to do that. I think that's the clue, at least.
So just a very brief follow-up question. When you say we haven't tried that enough, when you say that, you mean what, like explicitly?
I mean explicitly a consistent strategy for getting workers in motion around their demands.
All right.
I would say.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I would ask you to elaborate on your strategy to take that kind of local anti-austerity politics and make it go national, and what you see as the failure. You mentioned not organizing workplaces enough, but how does that relate to taking the local politics and going national? Did you just need more local politics aside from yourself?
Well, these are really two fields. So, but perhaps one of the problems with the anti-austerity politics is that people don't really care that much about it. That was sort of an experience we made. When there was a certain section being attacked, say nursery stuff, yeah, then they were angry, but no one else cared. And then when there was some other section being attacked, then they were angry, but no one else cared. When it was about kids, in the nursery homes, the parents were angry, but they didn't care as soon as the kids were out. So I think we overestimated the potentiality in that, to be honest. But our idea was, like I said, this is decided nationally, but enforced locally. So our ideas was sort of we should build up resistance locally and show that there is actually possible to stop this. And with that, show that, we should do this more everywhere, sort of. And we like I said, we made attempts of going national twice, but for different reasons, it didn't go as well as planned. So we have members all over Sweden, but pretty much only local activity.
Can you elaborate on the exact reasons why you weren't able to go national?
Yeah. Well, the first attempt was a way back now. That was in 2010. And reason for that was that we were too young, I think. So people were kids, and they don't have kids themselves, which they many times have sooner or later. And priorities change, and people don't have real jobs, so they can be radical at will. And we weren't prepared for that, I think, and we didn't help those setting up shop elsewhere enough. It was pretty much up to them to do it, so to speak. So activity closed down, but people remain in the organization still for long, many of them. And second time, it was a merger we did with a splinter group from a Stalinist party in Sweden that broke into pieces. I'm not really sure why we didn't succeed better this time. I need to think more of that. But it comes down to personal reasons as well, because everything is small. We need to remember that. We're not talking big organizations here. And then there's always a problem when some leading figure moves away from some place, things collapse. And that pretty much what happened with the other group we merged with. So their stronghold, their equivalent of our Västervik, so to speak, fell apart. And that was it.
Thanks a bunch.
All right, it's 6 minutes past 11. I think we can wrap up here. Let's have, please, another big round of applause for Johannes.